going to speak to you about holiday drownings under the title Recreation and Tourism. And the article that appears in Drowning was prepared by myself and my colleague from the Philippines, Arne Navarro. The World Health Organization states that accidents are the most common non-natural cause of death and injury for tourists. In other words, if you're a tourist, you're more likely to die from an accident than from illness. Within the European Union, tourists are 15 times more at risk of injury than they are from disease. And the United States Center for Disease Control states that American tourists abroad are 10 times more likely to die from an injury than they are from a disease. A problem with collecting data about holiday drownings is that in some countries, the tourism industry doesn't want any bad news about their resorts, and therefore there is plenty of anecdotal evidence to state that there are active measures taken to restrict or prevent bad news getting out on the basis that drowning prevention information would make parents wary and therefore it's bad for business. I'll give you an example of what can happen. One of my cousins, a good number of years ago, whilst on holidays in an apart hotel in Mallorca, drowned. Immediately, his companions were moved to a different hotel. The following day, when they returned to the hotel to make some inquiries, no one would admit that a drowning had taken place, and they were referred to the police. It had never happened. One of the challenges, as far as the industry is concerned, as I say, any prevention, any mention is bad for business. And one of the challenges that's facing the world life-saving community is to try and establish that drowning prevention information is not actually bad for business, but it's quite the opposite. Here's some statistics. Of all tourists who die accidentally, now please take note, not of all tourists who die, but of those who die accidentally. Within the European Union, between 5% and 14% of those who die accidentally drown. Now, the reason for the wide range and variation in the range is the fact that some European countries are inland and others are coastal, so therefore you won't get very many surf drownings in Austria. In Australia, between 20% and 25% of all tourists who die accidentally, they drown. Now, before I get a phone call from the Australian embassy, let me repeat. 25% of all tourists going to Australia will not drown. It is in fact only of those who do drown. And Australia, the Australian government is working with Surf Lifesaving in Australia and with Royal Lifesaving Australia, actually promoting it. And Australia is leading the way in this field in actually making a deliberate attempt to give drowning prevention information to visitors. Within the Philippines, in what would be an LMIC, 71% of those who drowned were tourists. Within Phuket in Thailand, 79% of all those who were rescued were tourists. So clearly you can see that tourists have a much higher risk of drowning than locals. Here's some other facts. The peak holiday months are also the peak drowning months, and the majority of those who drown are male. And neither of the two of those will come as a surprise to you because they're almost universal things. In summer months, we go to the sea, we go bathing, and therefore we have a higher exposure to water. 70% of Europeans, according to Eurostat, which is the European Union's statistical office, we holiday at water locations. And males who are likely to drink alcohol and involve in horseplay when they're at home are not likely to change their habits and their actions when they're on holidays. In fact, they're more likely to drink more and get engaged in a lot more horseplay. This is a report, this was a statement issued by the UK's Foreign Office, which basically says that 600 British nationals are rescued from drowning in Australia annually and that most of them were drinking alcohol. So let's look at some majorities. The majority of those who drown while they're on holidays are swimming or wading. They're actually intentionally in the water, which is not the norm for general drownings. Children and young teenagers drown in swimming pools. Older teenagers and adults drown in open water. There's a possibility, and the possibility is worthy of investigation, that exposure to water increases the risk of drowning. Now, let me make a distinction. Locals who live in an area, although they live close to the water, they're usually working. They're servicing the tourism industry. They're giving you your coffee. They're selling you your alcohol. The children are in school. So although they're actually around the water, they're engaged in activities that don't put them in the water, whereas those on holidays are spending their time lounging around pools, in the beach, drinking. Let's look at children. Portugal reports that 2 out of 3 children hospitalized after drowning incidents are tourists. And in the United Kingdom, more UK children drown while on holiday than drown at home in the United Kingdom, in spite of the fact that the number of children who are on holiday is only a small fraction of the actual total number of children in the UK. So it's the location and the activity. So why are children at risk? Well, let's look at when they're at risk, at 3 particular times. The very first day of a holiday, in the early morning, and the very last day of a holiday. The first day of a holiday, the location is new. Mom, you've just arrived, you've traveled, you spent all day getting there. There's a lot of packing to be done or unpacking to be done, so the adults are occupied, and what often happens is the older children are given the responsibility of supervising the younger children. The location is new, we'll occupy them, send them down to the pool while we unpack. The early morning is a risk period because adults tend to sleep in, usually because they've been drinking, and the children wake up, and the children then need to occupy themselves, and there's a swimming pool outside or there's a beach outside, so we'll go to the pool while mom and dad are asleep. And the last day, because it's the reverse of the first day, the packing has to be done, and so we'll get in a last swim before, or we'll get the children down in the pool while we pack and sort out things. So therefore, first day, early morning, and last day. There is a breakdown in adult supervision, but it's also important to note that statistically, most children who drown are being supervised. There is some form of supervision, and it's not actually an absence or a lack of supervision, it's a lapse. In other words, it's the "I'll only be a minute" syndrome. I left my fags, I'm going for my cigarettes, I'm going for a coffee, I'll only be a minute, and then something happens. And here's a British father who's giving an account of what happened to his son, and the key one is here. My son was there in the water, I just looked away for a second and he was gone. It happens that quickly and your family's life is changed forever. I just looked away for a second. He was being supervised. It was a lapse in supervision. And again, as been mentioned already, for every one death, there are at least 4 serious injuries associated with drowning events. So that the reported number of those who drown, who die, can be increased 4-fold by those who survive but who are injured. There's not only physical image, there's psychological image. These are notes from my own interview notes, and they talk about a mother. And the key thing is the mother says, when he woke up in hospital, she's talking about a 7-year-old son. He said, "Mom, I was calling for you, but you didn't come." I said, "I was coming for you, love." But I saw in his eyes that he didn't believe me because he was unconscious when I caught him. And I have nightmares about that. So this is the mother. This is another aspect of it. The fact that she has now determined that there was a loss of confidence in her son. Because in this situation, they were in the sea. It was a wave, just a wave lifted up, and the wave caught him, and she caught the child before he disappeared, but psychological as well as physical. Drowning is multifactorial. We know that already. And one prevention factor alone isn't sufficient. And in many cases, the problem is that the parents assume that being able to swim will protect their children. So therefore, he can swim, he's safe. Surf Lifesaving Australia states that the majority of tourists who die by drowning or are rescued from drowning enter the water to swim or wade, often in or near rip currents. So they deliberately enter the water and they're displaying certain lacks. They display poor swimming ability, inexperience with surf, ignorance of rip currents, ignorance of tides, and they use unlifeguarded beaches. The United States Lifesaving Association, and incidentally, David mentioned it in relation to Brazil, that rip currents make up 80% of all surf beach rescues. And here's a photograph that was taken by a lifeguard, and this is a mother and child, and they're about to enter the rip. Now, they're not allowed to enter the rip because the photograph is taken by one lifeguard while other lifeguards are reacting, right? And the mother stated that she had taken the child down, and this was the only part of the beach where there were no waves, and her son didn't like waves, so she was taking him in to the only part of the beach that there were no waves. This is a news report from 2014 recently, last August. Basically, 32 people rescued from a rip current by RNLI lifeguards in Cornwall. Adult water activities combine 5 things, 5 features. The first is young adult males who've been drinking alcohol with poor swimming ability. They're at an ocean location and they're doing adventure water activities. Each one has a risk factor itself. Around 20% of all those who drown on holidays, who by accidents, right, have been involved in adventure activities. Within the Philippines, of those who drowned while involved in adventure activities, 44% were scuba diving, that was the adventure activity, and 22% were parasailing, that was the activity. Another feature that goes with young adult males is the I dare you. There were 50 plus deaths in the United States 2006 while whitewater rafting. Look at them. And what happens is you get a group together. Not all of them are experienced, not all of them are good swimmers, and pressure is put onto the weak ones to join in the activity. Something like this happens and you have panic and you have a drowning. Which is a UK consumer magazine, and it basically said that water sport operators are flouting basic rules of safety, putting holidaymakers' lives at risk. And how did they put the lives at risk? They said no life jackets, or the life jackets were the wrong size, or they were damaged, or there was no kill switch on the driver. In other words, that if the driver fell off the ride, it continued as such with the people on it. So just because an activity takes place, even within the European Union, it does not mean that it is safe. This is me. Convenience kills. This is my belief. And this is an example. Research indicates that when choosing a beach, tourists often go to the nearest beach. Going back to that first day situation, you arrive, you go to the nearest beach. And if you've been traveling all day and you're hot and you're sweaty, you go for a swim. Doesn't matter whether it's lifeguarded or not. The research of interviewers asking people on the beach, why did you pick this beach? The most common answer given was it was the nearest to our accommodation. The advice that we have is find a lifeguarded beach. Right? Now, here's the thing about lifeguarded beaches. Ignorance kills as well. Because sometimes there is a belief that a lifeguarded beach is safe. Safe. Not the fact that it's the lifeguards working on the beach that makes it safer, but the fact that it's a lifeguarded beach means it's safe. Don't ignore the flags. Lifeguards don't put flags out for bunting. It's not for decoration. It's communicating with the public, but very often the public don't understand what they're saying. And particularly if the notices that are used are in a different language, you should ask, what's the notice saying? Research indicates that for every one rescue performed by a lifeguard, they do 50 preventions. Most of it is simple. It's saying, please don't do this and don't do it here or do it elsewhere. Right? This is a leaflet I authored for the Life Saving Foundation about 6 or 7 years ago. And in it, I postulate that assumptions kill. It's our positive assumptions, not the negative ones. It's the positive assumptions, right? And one of the ones is that it's the same at home. If the person is wearing a lifeguarded uniform, then he or she is trained to the same standard as the lifeguards we are used to at home. Not so. This is ROSPA, which is the Royal Society for Preventive Actions, basically saying that individual countries have their own legislation. So, just because a person is wearing a lifeguarded uniform does not mean that he or she is safe. These are some of the dangerous assumptions, and I'll quickly go through them. I can drink alcohol while supervising my children. Being able to swim protects us from drowning. His older brother is watching him. That's when he's not watching the girls. And if they're on the Toplet speech, I wouldn't want my older brother watching me. He's wearing a wetsuit, so he cannot drown. She's wearing a life jacket, so she can't drown. It's a diving board. So if the diving board is there, it must be deep enough to dive. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been allowed put it there. There's a lifeguard, so it's safe to leave our children. The lifeguard will mind them. And there are enforced laws to make water sports safe. The European Union has more laws than anything else, but it has no laws that deal with water sport. This is the advice the foundation gives. Take the time to check it out. Don't go in first. Stand and look and watch, because the 5 minutes that you waste while you're checking it out could make the difference between the 50 years that you live afterwards regretting that you didn't do it. I love this image. Really like it, right? This has come from Australia, part of the thing. This is the concept of the internal tourist. In other words, that just because it's your country, that you're not counted. I skipped two. No, I didn't. Surf Life Saving Australia, 49% of drowning casualties were Australians, right? Living more than 50 kilometers, 30 miles from the beach. In other words, when we talk about being a local, we mean this is where I live, not local to the country. And in Hawaii, research in Hawaii said that half of those who drowned were Hawaiians. In fact, the Hawaiians reported that the biggest cause of drownings is what they called being pounded by the surf. In other words, people who were not used to surf coming inland, going to the ocean, and because they've actually devoted so much time getting to the ocean, they're going in because they've invested that time. Here are some holiday facts, and I'm almost finished. Tourists are more likely to drown than locals. Most tourists who drown do so while they're bathing. They deliberately get into the water. Beginning and end of holidays are danger times. Non-fatal drowning accidents outnumber 4 times the number of fatal ones. Equipment safety laws are often not enforced. Adults who drown are often not missed for hours. This is a feature. Group of adults go out drinking, one of them drowns, and it'll be hours before they miss him because there's a group of them there and they're all busy with themselves. And alcohol consumption is a major factor in tourist drownings. Children are at risk in pools. Anyone can wear a lifeguard uniform, and the last one is the quality of trained help may not be the same as at home. In other words, you cannot assume that there is a hospital within 15, 20, 30 minutes, that if something happens and there is a rescue, that you are going to have advanced life support. What's needed? Research, information, and training. Does the provision of safety information reduce tourism numbers? This is a key factor. We have to convince the tourism industry that it's in their interest to give information. In the Philippines, they made a determination that they would distribute information. In Australia, they're doing the same thing. In other words, if we tell the people, you will be safer if you do this, it will encourage tourism. And the question again, how do you get the public to use lifeguarded beaches? How do you get the social movement so that they will not use the first beach, but they will go to a lifeguarded beach? Information. information should be provided specific to the holiday location. In other words, if you're opening the tourist brochure, you should be able to see whether or not the beach is lifeguarded. You can find out if there's a babysitting service. You can find out if you can park your car. But is the beach lifeguarded? No. And the Blue Flag scheme is one international scheme that's been used around the place, which you fly the blue flag and then it has certain facilities, including lifeguards. And finally, financial and technical assistance is needed in developing countries. They need money, they need training. It's been done, but more of it needs to be done. And again, web-based training on risk assessment. In other words, we're saying to parents, you know, check it out. But we need to tell them what to look for. If you go back to the woman who thought that the best place to swim with her son was in the part of the ocean that didn't have waves, because she didn't know that was the rip. Tommy Creeknaha. I'm finished.